The marble floor felt like ice against my knees as I collapsed, the marriage certificate slipping from my trembling fingers and floating down like a death sentence. 25 years. 25 years I had buried this name, convinced it would never surface again to haunt me. But there it was, written in elegant black ink that might as well have been my own blood. Kostas Petros Vasilakis. My daughter had married a Vasilakis. The name echoed in my head like thunder rolling across the Aegean Sea, each syllable a reminder of what I had done, what I had destroyed, what I had tried so desperately to forget. My hands shook as I reached for the certificate again, hoping against hope that my eyes had deceived me, that the stress of the wedding preparations had made me hallucinate. But no, there it was, clear as the Mediterranean sun, Vasilakis. I am Alexandros Dimitri Theokoropoulos, and for 58 years I have lived as a king among men. My grandfather started with nothing but calloused hands and a dream building our family empire from the ground up through sheer determination and sacrifice. By the time I inherited the business, we owned half of Athens' most prestigious real estate, a fleet of ships that carried goods across 3 continents, and enough political influence to shape the very future of Greece itself. But empires, I learned long ago, are not built with clean hands. The Mediterranean breeze that usually brought me peace now felt suffocating as it drifted through the open terrace doors of my Kafesia mansion. The scent of jasmine from Melina's garden mixed with the distant aroma of grilled octopus from the tavernas below, creating a cocktail of memories that made my stomach lurch. This house, this life, this carefully constructed paradise, all of it was built on the bones of people whose names I had tried to erase from history, including the Vasilakis family. Let me tell you something about guilt. It never truly goes away. It sits in your chest like a cold stone, sometimes so quiet you forget it's there, other times pressing against your lungs until you can barely breathe. For 25 years, that stone had been my constant companion, and now it felt like it was going to crush me completely. I pulled myself up from the floor, my expensive Italian suit wrinkled and my pride in tatters. The grandfather clock in the corner, a piece my own grandfather had bought during his first successful business deal, ticked away the seconds with mechanical precision. Each sound a reminder that time was running out. My daughter Sophia would be returning from her honeymoon in Santorini in 3 days, glowing with newlywed happiness, completely unaware that her father had destroyed her husband's family before she was even born. The irony was almost poetic. My beautiful Sophia, with her mother's kind eyes and my stubborn determination, had always been drawn to authenticity in a world of artificial glamour. While other wealthy Greek families sent their daughters to marry within their social circle, Sophia had rebelled against everything I represented. She studied architecture in Paris, lived in tiny apartments, dated struggling artists, and consistently chose substance over superficiality. And now she had chosen Kostas Vasilakis. I had met him twice before the wedding. Once when Sophia first brought him to dinner, and again during the engagement celebration. Both times I had been struck by his quiet dignity, his calloused hands that spoke of honest work, his genuine love for my daughter that radiated from every glance, every gentle touch. He reminded me of my own grandfather, humble, hard-working, sincere. If only I had known his last name then. If only I had connected the dots sooner. But Sophia had introduced him simply as Kostas, and in my arrogance, I had never bothered to ask for his full name. Why would I need to know the surname of some farmer from Macedonia? He was beneath my notice, a temporary distraction that I assumed my sophisticated daughter would eventually outgrow. How wrong I had been about everything. I walked to my study, each step echoing through the empty house like a funeral march. Melina, my sister-in-law, had gone to visit her cousin in Thessaloniki, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my guilt. The study was my sanctuary, filled with first-edition books, ancient Greek artifacts, and photographs documenting 3 generations of Theokoropoulos' success. But today, it felt like a museum of crimes. I poured myself 3 fingers of aged whiskey, the good stuff from Scotland that cost more than most people made in a month, and sat behind my mahogany desk, the same desk where I had signed the papers that destroyed Petros Vasilakis and his family, the same desk where I had made phone calls to politicians and bureaucrats, pulling strings and calling in favors to ensure that a simple olive farmer could never recover from what I was about to do to him. Have you ever wondered what it takes to destroy an innocent man's life? I used to think it required some kind of inherent evil, a darkness of soul that marked certain people as monsters. But the truth is far more terrifying. It just requires opportunity, desperation, and the ability to convince yourself that your needs matter more than someone else's survival. In 1998, I was 33 years old and drowning in debt. My father had died suddenly the year before, leaving me with a business that looked successful from the outside, but was hemorrhaging money due to some disastrous investments in Russian oil. I had 6 months, maybe 8, before the creditors came calling. My wife Helena was pregnant with Sophia, and the thought of losing everything my grandfather had built, of disappointing the woman I loved more than life itself, drove me to consider options I never would have entertained in my right mind. That's when I learned about the Vasilakis olive groves. Petros Vasilakis owned 300 acres of prime agricultural land in northern Greece, with olive trees that were over 200 years old. The land had been in his family for 6 generations, passed down from father to son like a sacred trust. But more importantly, it sat directly in the path of a proposed highway expansion that would connect Athens to the northern port cities. Land that was worth perhaps $50,000 as farmland would be worth $10 million as a strategic transportation corridor. The problem was that Petros Vasilakis had no intention of selling. I still remember the first time I met him. It was a crisp autumn day in Macedonia, the kind where the air smells like wood smoke and crushed grapes, and the olive trees shimmer silver in the afternoon sun. Petros was a man in his early 60s, with hands like tree bark and eyes the color of rich soil. He welcomed me into his modest farmhouse with the kind of hospitality that defines Greek culture, offering me coffee that his wife Eleni had prepared from beans they imported directly from Ethiopia. We sat on his terrace, overlooking rows of ancient olive trees that his great-great-grandfather had planted with his own hands. Petros spoke about his land with the passion of a poet, describing each tree's personality, each section's unique microclimate, each season's different gifts. His grandson, a boy of perhaps 3 years old, played at our feet, chasing chickens and laughing with the pure joy that only children possess. That grandson was Kostas, the little boy who rolled in the dirt between olive trees, who helped his grandfather collect eggs from the chickens, who fell asleep in his grandmother's arms while she hummed ancient Greek lullabies. That innocent child grew up to be the man my daughter married, the man I was now terrified to face. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what I did to his family first. During that first meeting, I offered Petros what I thought was a generous price for his land, 3 times its agricultural value. He listened politely, served me more coffee, and then gently but firmly explained that the land was not for sale. Not for 3 times its value, not for 10 times its value, not for any amount of money I could offer. This was his family's legacy, he explained, the foundation upon which 6 generations had built their lives. His grandson would inherit these trees someday, just as he had inherited them from his own grandfather. I respected his position, or at least I told myself I did. But respect doesn't pay creditors, and respect doesn't save failing businesses. Over the next month, I had my lawyers research every possible angle. Were there environmental violations, tax irregularities, zoning issues, anything that could give me leverage to force a sale? What we discovered was devastating in its simplicity. Petros Vasilakis had made one small error in his tax filings 3 years earlier, an honest mistake involving the classification of some equipment that resulted in an underpayment of roughly $2,000. In normal circumstances, this would have been corrected with a simple amendment and a small penalty. But in the hands of someone with political connections and flexible morals, it became a weapon of mass destruction. I made a phone call to a friend in the tax authority. Just one phone call, lasting perhaps 10 minutes. I explained that I had discovered a significant tax violation by a landowner in Macedonia, and that a thorough investigation might reveal additional irregularities that could benefit the state's revenue collection efforts. I mentioned, casually, that this particular landowner possessed valuable property that might be subject to seizure if the violations were severe enough. If you've ever felt the weight of a single decision that changed everything, you know what I'm talking about. 10 minutes on the phone, and I had set in motion a chain of events that would destroy an entire family. But at the time, I told myself I was just exploring options, just gathering information. I wasn't actually doing anything harmful yet. The investigation began 3 weeks later. Tax officials, environmental inspectors, labor regulators. Suddenly, Petros Vasilakis found himself under scrutiny from every government agency you could imagine. They discovered more violations, paperwork, irregularities, minor safety issues, classification errors that stretched back decades. Each violation carried fines and penalties that multiplied exponentially when combined, with interest and administrative fees. Within 6 months, Petros owed the government more money than his land was worth. I watched from Athens as his world crumbled. Through private investigators and local contacts, I monitored every stage of his destruction. The first thing to go was his equipment. The tractors and harvesting machinery that his father had saved for years to purchase. Then came the livestock, sold at auction for pennies on the dollar. His bank accounts were frozen, his credit destroyed, his reputation in the community shattered by whispers that he was a tax cheat and a fraud. But still, he held on to the land. Have you ever seen a man choose dignity over survival? Petros Vasilakis could have sold to me at any point during those terrible months. Even after the fines and penalties, even after the legal fees and the stress, he could have walked away with enough money to start over somewhere else, but he refused. This was his family's legacy, he insisted. This was sacred ground, blessed by generations of honest labor and love. His stubbornness should have impressed me. Instead, it infuriated me. I increased the pressure. More inspections, more violations, more fines. I had friends in the media plant stories about tax evasion in rural Greece, using Petros as an unnamed example of farmers who refused to pay their fair share. I had local officials suggest that his continued resistance was unpatriotic, that he was preventing economic development that could benefit the entire region. The stress began taking its toll. Petros developed high blood pressure, then diabetes, then heart problems. His wife Eleni started suffering from anxiety attacks that left her bedridden for days at a time. Their son, Kostas' father, tried to help by taking a second job in Thessaloniki, but the additional income was a drop in the ocean compared to the growing debt. And through it all, little Kostas continued playing between the olive trees, oblivious to the fact that his world was being systematically destroyed by a man he had never met. The end came in winter. February 14th, 1999, Valentine's Day, if you can believe the cruel irony. I was in my office, reviewing the financial projections that showed my business finally returning to profitability thanks to the highway development project I was now part of, when my lawyer called with the news. Petros Vasilakis had suffered a massive heart attack that morning. He was found in his olive grove, collapsed between two of the ancient trees his great-great-grandfather had planted. The doctors said the stress had literally broken his heart. He died holding a handful of soil from his land. 3 days later, his family was forced to sell the property to cover the outstanding debt. I purchased it through a shell company for exactly the amount they owed the government. Not a single euro more than necessary to clear their obligations. Within a month, I had resold it to the Highway Development Consortium for 40 times what I'd paid. The profit from that single transaction saved my business and secured my family's fortune for generations to come. But it came at a price I never expected to pay. Eleni Vasilakis never recovered from her husband's death. She spent her remaining years in a small apartment in Thessaloniki, supported by her son who worked 3 jobs to pay for her medical care. She died 5 years later, broken and alone, never having returned to the land where she had spent the happiest years of her life. Their son, Kostas' father, struggled with alcoholism and depression, unable to process the loss of everything his family had worked for across generations. He died in a car accident when Kostas was 15, leaving the boy to be raised by his paternal grandmother, Alina Vasilakis. I learned all of this through the private investigators I hired to monitor the family. I told myself it was necessary, for legal reasons, to ensure they didn't pursue any challenges to the land sale. But the truth was darker. I was obsessed with understanding the full consequences of what I had done, like a man who couldn't stop probing a wound to see how deep it went. Alina Vasilakis, Petros' mother, was made of tougher material than the rest of her family. Even in her 70s, she possessed a strength and dignity that reminded me uncomfortably of my own grandmother. She sold everything she owned to buy a small olive farm in the mountains, determined to preserve what was left of the family tradition. She raised Kostas herself, teaching him everything his grandfather and father should have taught him about the land, about honor, about the price of standing up for what you believe in. She never forgot who destroyed her family, and she never forgave. For 25 years, I told myself that I had made a difficult but necessary business decision. Markets are ruthless, I reasoned. Competition is brutal. If I hadn't taken advantage of Petros Vasilakis' vulnerability, someone else would have. That's how capitalism works. The strong survive, the weak are consumed, and sentiment is a luxury that successful men cannot afford. I built my empire on that foundation of lies and self-justification. I expanded into shipping, real estate development, technology, investments. I married my beloved Helena, raised my daughter in luxury, lived a life that most people could only dream of. I donated to charities, supported the arts, contributed to political causes. I became the kind of man that society celebrates, successful, influential, respectable. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the weight of solitude pressed down on me like a physical force, I would remember Petros Vasilakis collapsing in his olive grove. I would remember his grandson playing innocently between the trees, unaware that his future was being destroyed by a stranger's greed. I would remember Eleni's tears at her husband's funeral, and her son's desperate attempts to hold together a family that was already broken beyond repair. Those memories lived in my chest like a cancer, growing stronger with each passing year. And now, impossibly, that innocent little boy had grown up to marry my daughter. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor far crueler than any Greek tragedy. I stood up from my desk and walked to the window overlooking Athens. The city sprawled below me like a glittering carpet, millions of lights representing millions of lives, millions of stories, millions of dreams and disappointments. Somewhere out there, people were falling in love, starting families, building futures. Somewhere out there, my daughter and her new husband were probably walking hand in hand through the narrow streets of Santorini, planning a life together that had no room for the darkness of the past. But the past has a way of catching up with you, doesn't it? No matter how fast you run, no matter how high you build your walls, no matter how much money you accumulate or power you wield, the past is always there, waiting patiently for the right moment to remind you of who you really are. I had a choice to make, and I had to make it quickly. I could tell Sophia the truth, confess everything I had done to her husband's family, explain the connection between our names, and hope that love could somehow bridge the gap between victim and victimizer. Or I could keep my secret, find a way to separate my daughter from this man, and pray that the truth never surfaced to destroy everything I had built. The first option felt like suicide. How could Sophia ever look at me the same way again, knowing that her father was responsible for her husband's family tragedy? How could she continue living in a house built with blood money, wearing jewelry purchased with funds stolen from innocent people, enjoying a lifestyle that was made possible by the destruction of everything her husband held sacred? But the second option felt like murder. Sophia was genuinely, deeply, completely in love with Kostas Vasilakis. I had seen it in her eyes during the engagement party, heard it in her voice when she talked about him, felt it in the way she moved when he was near. To separate them would be to cut out her heart and feed it to the wolves. But what choice did I have? If Kostas ever learned the truth about his family's destruction, if he ever connected the dots between the Theokoropoulos fortune and the Vasilakis tragedy, he would have every right to demand justice. He could destroy my business, my reputation, my freedom. He could take everything I had worked for and burn it to the ground in the name of righteousness. More importantly, he could take my daughter away from me forever. No, I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't let that happen. I had spent 25 years building walls around my secret, and I would spend the next 25 years reinforcing them if necessary. Sophia would understand eventually. She was young, infatuated, blinded by romantic notions about love conquering all. But she was also practical, intelligent, and ultimately loyal to her family. With the right approach, the right incentives, the right pressure applied at the right moments, I could help her see that this marriage was a mistake. For her own good, of course, for everyone's good. I picked up the phone and dialed my lawyers. Number: Dimitri Nikos Stavropoulos had been my friend since childhood, my confidant through every major decision, my accomplice in more questionable dealings than either of us cared to remember. If anyone could help me navigate this situation, it was Dimitri Alexandros. His voice carried a note of concern. It was nearly midnight, and I rarely called him at home unless there was an emergency. "What's wrong? I need you to come to the house," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "Bring everything you have on the Vasilakis file from 1998. There was a long pause. The Vasilakis file, Alexandros. That case was closed decades ago. Why would you need ... Just bring it," I interrupted. "And Dimitri, this conversation never happened." Another pause, longer this time. Dimitri had been my lawyer long enough to recognize the tone that meant questions were not welcome. "I'll be there in an hour." I hung up the phone and poured myself another whiskey, this one larger than the first. The alcohol burned my throat, but it did nothing to warm the cold certainty that was settling in my bones. I was about to embark on a course of action that would require me to lie to my daughter, manipulate her emotions, and possibly destroy her happiness. But what was the alternative? Confess everything and watch my world collapse. Stand by helplessly as the consequences of my past decisions destroyed my future. I was Alexandros Dimitri Theokoropoulos, heir to an empire built on strength and determination. I had not survived 58 years in a world of sharks and vultures by allowing sentiment to cloud my judgment. I would find a way to separate Sophia from this man. I would protect my family, my business, my legacy, and if that meant breaking my daughter's heart in the process, well, sometimes love required making difficult choices. The sound of tires on gravel announced Dimitri's arrival. I watched from the window as his black Mercedes pulled through the security gates and up the circular driveway. My lawyer emerged, carrying a leather briefcase that I knew contained the documents I had hoped never to see again: contracts, tax records, investigation reports, and correspondence that detailed every step of Petros Vasilakis' destruction. As Dimitri walked toward my front door, his footsteps echoing in the quiet night air, I felt something shift inside my chest. The weight of 25 years of guilt was transforming into something harder, colder, more focused. I was no longer the remorseful man who had collapsed on his marble floor a few hours earlier. I was a general preparing for war, and the stakes could not be higher. Dimitri entered my study like a man walking into a funeral, his usually confident demeanor replaced by the careful wariness of someone who had learned, through decades of friendship, to recognize when I was capable of dangerous decisions. He set his briefcase on my desk with the reverence one might show a bomb, then poured himself a drink without asking permission. We had known each other since we were 8 years old, climbing olive trees in his father's grove and dreaming of conquering the world together. Now, at 60 years old, he was the only person alive who knew every skeleton in my closet. "The Vasilakis file," he said simply, clicking open the briefcase. 25 years old, and you still keep it locked. In my safe. Most men would have burned these documents long ago. "Most men don't have my attention to detail," I replied, watching as he spread the contents across my desk like a dealer laying out cards for a final hand of poker. "Tell me you remember everything." Dimitri's fingers traced the edge of a tax assessment document that had started it all. I remember a young man drowning in debt who asked me to find legal ways to acquire specific agricultural property. I remember a series of unfortunate coincidences that led to a family's financial ruin. And I remember watching you build an empire on the foundation of what happened to Petros Vasilakis. He looked up at me with eyes that held no judgment, only the weary acceptance of someone who had been complicit in moral compromises for most of his adult life. What I don't remember is why you're revisiting ancient history at midnight. I slid the marriage certificate across the desk to him. My daughter married his grandson 3 days ago. Dimitri's face went white as Mediterranean limestone. He picked up the certificate with hands that trembled slightly, reading the name over and over as if repetition might somehow change the letters. Kostas Petros Vasilakis, he whispered. My God, Alexandros, the universe has a twisted sense of justice. Justice implies that I've done something wrong, I said, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. This is just an unfortunate coincidence that needs to be managed carefully. Managed. Dimitri's voice rose slightly before he caught himself and glanced toward the door, remembering that even in my own house, certain conversations required discretion. Alexandros, do you understand what this means? If this young man ever learns what happened to his family, if he ever connects your wealth to their poverty, he could destroy everything. Criminal charges, civil lawsuits, media exposure, your business, your reputation, your freedom, all of it could disappear overnight. I leaned back in my chair, studying my oldest friend's face. Dimitri had always been the cautious one, the voice of reason that kept me from making impulsive decisions. But caution was a luxury I could no longer afford. That's exactly why we're going to make sure he never learns the truth. And how do you propose we do that? By convincing him to divorce my daughter and disappear from our lives forever. Dimitri set down his drink so hard that whiskey splashed across my ancient Persian rug. You want to destroy your daughter's marriage. I want to protect my daughter's future. She's 25 years old, Dimitri. She's infatuated with this man because he represents everything her privileged life has. Lacked authenticity, simplicity, honest work. But infatuation fades. Love based on rebellion against your upbringing doesn't last. In 5 years, she realized that she has nothing in common with a farmer from Macedonia, and she'd come to resent the sacrifice of everything she was born to inherit. It was a convincing argument, and I almost believed it myself. But the truth was simpler and uglier. I was terrified. Terrified of losing everything I had built. Terrified of facing the consequences of my past actions. Terrified of seeing the love in my daughter's eyes turn to hatred when she learned what kind of man her father really was. Dimitri studied the documents spread across my desk, his legal mind already working through possibilities and consequences. What do you know about this Kostas Vasilakis? Beyond his family history, I mean. Very little. Sophia met him at some environmental conference in Brussels. He owns a small organic olive farm in northern Macedonia, apparently focused on sustainable agriculture and traditional growing methods. He's educated, studied agricultural science at the University of Thessaloniki. No criminal record, no debts, no apparent vices. I paused, remembering the quiet dignity in the young man's eyes during our brief meetings. He genuinely loves her, Dimitri. That much is obvious, which will make separating them considerably more difficult. Dimitri picked up a photograph from the file, Petros Vasilakis, standing proudly beside his ancient olive trees. Young Kostas visible in the background as a toddler. Men who love deeply don't give up easily, especially when they're fighting for something they see as righteous. Then, we need to give him a reason to give up. Something stronger than love, such as I had been thinking about this since the moment I recognized the name on the marriage certificate. Money. Everyone has a price, Dmitri. Even the most principled man can be tempted if the offer is large enough and the presentation is sophisticated enough. You want to bribe him. I want to offer him an opportunity to secure his family's financial future while pursuing his passion for agriculture on a much larger scale. We'll present it as an investment opportunity, a chance to expand his operation to become a leader in sustainable farming across the Mediterranean region. All he has to do is agree that his marriage to Sophia was a mistake born of youthful impulse, and that they're both better off pursuing their separate destinies. Dmitri rubbed his temples as if trying to massage away an approaching headache. And if he refuses, then we escalate to more persuasive measures, meaning... I stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the lights of Athens. Somewhere in that sprawling city were people I had helped over the years, politicians who owed their careers to my support, business leaders who had benefited from my investments, journalists who had built their reputations on stories I had provided. Favors could be called in, pressure could be applied, investigations could be launched into the most innocent of activities. Even the cleanest man leaves traces that can be misinterpreted by those with sufficient motivation and resources. Meaning that everyone has vulnerabilities, Dmitri. Everyone has secrets, mistakes, relationships that could be portrayed in unflattering ways if the right pressure is applied. This Kostas Vasilakis may be an honest farmer, but I guarantee he's not perfect. We find his weaknesses, and we use them to convince him that staying married to my daughter would be hazardous to his health, his business, and his future. You're talking about blackmail. I'm talking about survival. Do you have any idea what my daughter would do if she learned the truth about her husband's family? She's not some sheltered princess who can be pacified with shopping trips and charity galas. Sophia has a moral compass that points true north, and she inherited my stubborn refusal to compromise on matters of principle. If she ever discovers that her comfortable life was built on the bones of the Vasilakis family, she burn everything down in the name of justice. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a funeral pyre. Dmitri had known Sophia since she was born, had watched her grow from a precocious child, who asked uncomfortable questions into a young woman who demanded uncomfortable truths. He understood, perhaps better than I did, that my daughter possessed the kind of integrity that could not be bought, threatened, or reasoned away. She might surprise you, he said quietly. People are capable of forgiveness, especially when they love someone. Are you willing to bet my empire on that possibility? Dmitri sighed and began gathering the documents back into his briefcase. What do you need from me? Everything you can find on Kostas Vasilakis, financial records, educational background, business relationships, personal associations. I want to know where he banks, where he shops, who he considers friends, what he does in his spare time. And I want to know about his grandmother, Alina Vasilakis. She's the only surviving member of the original family, and if there's any residual knowledge about what happened to Petros, she would be the one carrying it. This is going to take time, Alexandros. The kind of deep background investigation you're describing requires weeks, maybe months. I don't have months. Sophia and Kostas return from their honeymoon in 3 days. I need enough information to make my first approach by the end of the week. And if this approach fails, if Kostas Vasilakis proves to be incorruptible... I turned away from the window and met my friend's gaze with the kind of cold determination that had built my fortune and destroyed my enemies. Then we'll discover just how incorruptible he really is when faced with the alternative. Dmitri left my house at 3 in the morning, carrying with him a list of tasks that would have challenged the resources of a small intelligence agency. But I had learned long ago that with sufficient money and motivation, almost any information could be obtained, almost any pressure could be applied, almost any problem could be solved. The question was not whether I could find leverage against Kostas Vasilakis, but how much damage I would have to inflict in the process. The next 2 days passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and carefully orchestrated research. I contacted associates in northern Greece, asking casual questions about organic farming operations and sustainable agriculture initiatives. I had my accountants review agricultural loan programs and environmental grants that might be relevant to a small olive producer looking to expand. I even went so far as to have my personal chef research traditional Macedonian cuisine, preparing myself to demonstrate cultural appreciation during my eventual confrontation with my daughter's husband. But mostly, I waiting for investigators to provide the intelligence I needed, waiting for Sophia and Kostas to return from their honeymoon, waiting for the phone call that would tell me whether my enemy could be bought, threatened, or destroyed. Have you ever tried to function normally while your entire world hangs in the balance? I conducted business meetings with partners who had no idea that their colleague was secretly planning to blackmail his own. I attended social functions where friends congratulated me on my daughter's marriage, smiling and accepting their good wishes, while plotting to destroy the very relationship they were celebrating. I even visited my wife's grave, standing beside Helena's headstone and wondering what she would think of the man I had become in the years. Since her death, Helena had been my moral compass, the gentle voice that reminded me to consider the human cost of my business decisions. She would have been horrified by what I was planning, but Helena was gone, taken by cancer when Sophia was 17. And I had been navigating the treacherous waters of power and wealth without her guidance for 8 long years. Perhaps if she had lived, I would have been a different man. Perhaps I would have found the courage to confess my past mistakes and accept whatever consequences followed. But perhaps is a luxury that dead men and desperate fathers cannot afford. On Thursday morning, Dmitri called with his preliminary report. "I've got good news and bad news," he said, without preamble. "Which do you want first?" "Start with the bad news. I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Kostas Vasilakis is exactly what he appears to be, a genuinely decent man with no apparent weaknesses that we can exploit. His financial records show modest but consistent income from his olive farm, no debt beyond a reasonable agricultural loan, no questionable transactions or associations. His educational records are spotless. His business relationships are characterized by mutual respect and trust, and his personal life appears to be remarkably clean. No gambling, no drinking problems, no romantic entanglements prior to Sophia, no political activities that could be portrayed as extreme or dangerous. I felt my chest tighten with frustration and something that might have been grudging respect. And the good news is that his business is genuinely struggling. The organic olive oil market is extremely competitive. His farm is still recovering from a drought 3 years ago, and he's been operating on razor-thin margins for the past 18 months. A carefully structured financial offer might be genuinely appealing, especially if it's presented as an opportunity rather than a bribe. How much do you think it would take for a man like Kostas Vasilakis? More than you might expect. This isn't someone who can be bought with a simple cash payment. The offer would need to be substantial enough to be chained in, presented as a legitimate business opportunity, and structured in a way that allows him to maintain his dignity and his principles. I leaned back in my chair, calculating numbers and possibilities. 2 million euros, presented as an investment in sustainable agriculture, with him as the managing partner of a new environmental initiative. That might work, Dmitri said slowly. But Alexandros, you need to understand something. If this approach fails, if Kostas Vasilakis rejects your offer and begins asking questions about why you're so interested in separating him from your daughter, we could find ourselves in a much worse position than we're in now. Meaning that an honest man who feels threatened or manipulated might start digging into family histories, looking for explanations. And if he digs deep enough, if he asks the right questions of the right people, he might discover connections that we've spent 25 years keeping buried. The possibility sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air conditioning. But retreat was not an option. I had committed myself to this course of action, and commitment was the foundation upon which all successful enterprises were built. Then we make sure the offer is compelling enough that he doesn't feel threatened or manipulated. We present it as a coincidence, a fortunate opportunity that has nothing to do with his relationship with Sophia. And how do you explain your sudden interest in sustainable agriculture and organic farming? Diversification. My business portfolio has always included agricultural investments, and the growing market for environmentally conscious products represents a natural expansion opportunity. It's perfectly logical that I would seek out partnerships with established organic producers, especially those with demonstrated expertise and commitment to traditional methods. It was a believable cover story, and I could already imagine how I would present it to Kostas Vasilakis, a successful businessman recognizing the future potential of sustainable agriculture, seeking authentic partners who shared his vision of environmental responsibility and long-term profitability. The fact that this partner happened to be married to my daughter would be an amusing coincidence, a happy accident that would allow family and business to support each other. But first, I needed to see him again. I needed to study his reactions, test his vulnerabilities, understand how he thought, and what motivated him beyond his obvious love for Sophia. The wealthy man's greatest advantage in any negotiation is preparation, and I intended to be thoroughly prepared when I made my offer. Sophia and Kostas returned from Santorini on Friday evening, glowing with the kind of happiness that makes everyone around them feel both envious and hopeful. I watched from my study window as they pulled into the circular driveway in Kostas's ancient Toyota truck, laughing about something private and beautiful while they unloaded luggage that looked like it had been purchased from a discount travel store. My daughter had clearly embraced her new husband's philosophy of practical simplicity, trading her usual designer bags for a canvas backpack that had seen better decades. They looked perfect together, young, in love, untouched by the kind of compromises and calculations that define adult life. Watching them kiss beside his battered truck, I felt something crack inside my chest, a tiny fissure in the wall of justification I had built around my intentions. For just a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what might happen if I simply accepted this marriage, welcomed Kostas into our family, and buried the past so deeply that it could never surface to threaten anyone's happiness. But the moment passed, quickly replaced by the cold reality of consequence and survival. I was not a sentimental old man who could afford the luxury of noble gestures. I was a businessman, a strategist, a man who understood that the world operated according to rules. That had nothing to do with fairness or justice. Kostas Vasilakis might be a good man who genuinely loved my daughter, but he was also a loaded gun pointed at everything I had built, and loaded guns, no matter how beautiful they might appear, were always dangerous. I waited until Sunday evening before making my approach. Sophia had returned to her apartment in Kolonaki to prepare for work on Monday, leaving Kostas alone at the small hotel where they had decided to stay until they could find permanent housing. It was a modest establishment near the Acropolis, the kind of place that catered to tourists seeking authentic Greek experiences rather than luxury. Accommodations, I found him sitting on the hotel's rooftop terrace, drinking coffee and reading what appeared to be an agricultural journal. The setting sun painted the ancient marble of the Parthenon in shades of gold and amber, creating the kind of scene that travel photographers dream about and poets struggle to capture in words. Kostas looked completely at peace, a man comfortable with solitude and simple pleasures. "Mr. Vasilakis," I said, approaching his table with the kind of casual confidence that suggested this meeting was entirely accidental. "What a pleasant surprise. I hope you don't mind if I join you for a moment." He looked up with genuine warmth, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Of course, Mr. Theokoropoulos. Please, sit. Can I order you some coffee?" "That would be lovely, thank you." He signaled the waiter with the easy familiarity of someone who had already established a friendly relationship with the hotel staff. I recognized the gesture from my own grandfather, who had possessed the same ability to connect with people regardless of their social status or economic circumstances. It was a quality that commanded respect and inspired loyalty, the kind of authentic leadership that could not be bought or faked. "I trust you and Sophia enjoyed your honeymoon?" I asked, settling into my chair and studying his face for any signs of discomfort or suspicion. "It was perfect," he replied, and the simple sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten again. Sophia showed me parts of Santorini that most tourists never see: hidden beaches, local tavernas where her grandmother used to take her as a child. We spent most of our time just walking and talking, planning our future together. And what does that future look like? Forgive me for asking, but as Sophia's father, I'm naturally curious about your intentions. If he detected any ulterior motive. In my question, he didn't show it. "We're looking for a house somewhere between the city and my farm. Sophia wants to continue her architectural work, but she's also interested in helping me develop sustainable tourism initiatives that could supplement our agricultural income. She has some fascinating ideas about combining traditional farming education with modern environmental awareness." It was exactly the kind of idealistic plan that young couples create during romantic honeymoons, full of beautiful intentions and innocent optimism about the compatibility of different worlds. I had seen similar dreams crumble under the weight of practical reality countless times throughout my life. But Kostas spoke about these plans with the quiet confidence of someone who had carefully considered the challenges and remained committed to overcoming them. "That sounds like an admirable goal," I said. "I imagine it requires significant capital investment to develop that kind of operation." "Some, yes, but we're planning to start small and grow gradually." Sophia and I both believe the sustainable development should be, well, sustainable in every sense of the word. The waiter brought my coffee, and I used the interruption to gather my thoughts and refine my approach. Direct offers of money would almost certainly be rejected by a man like Kostas Vasilakis, but appeals to his obvious passion for environmental causes and agricultural innovation might be more successful. You know, I said, stirring honey into my coffee with deliberate casualness, your mention of sustainable agriculture interests me greatly. I've been considering diversifying my investment portfolio to include more environmentally conscious enterprises. Really, his eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested I had stumbled onto his favorite topic of conversation. What kind of environmental initiatives are you considering? Primarily agricultural projects that combine traditional methods with modern scientific understanding. Organic farming, heritage crop preservation, soil conservation techniques. The kind of work that produces both environmental benefits and long-term economic returns. That's exactly what we need more of in Greece, he said, leaning forward with genuine excitement. Too many farmers are still using industrial methods that deplete the soil and require constant chemical inputs. But the old techniques, the methods my grandfather and his grandfather used, they're actually more productive in the long run if you're willing to be patient and think beyond immediate profits. I found myself genuinely interested in his perspective, despite the ulterior motives that had brought me to this conversation. Kostas Vasilakis spoke about agriculture with the passion of an artist discussing his masterpiece, and his knowledge of soil science, crop rotation, and sustainable water management was impressively sophisticated. This was not some romantic dilettante playing at farming. This was a serious professional who happened to believe that ethical practices and economic success could coexist. Have you considered expanding your operation? I asked. It seems like there would be significant market demand for organic products produced using traditional methods. Constantly, he admitted. But expansion requires capital that I don't currently have access to. Banks are reluctant to lend money for organic agriculture because the returns take longer to materialize than conventional farming, and most private investors don't understand the agricultural sector well enough to feel comfortable with the risks involved. This was the opening I had been hoping for, and I felt a mixture of satisfaction and self-loathing as I prepared to exploit his financial vulnerability. What if I told you that I might be interested in partnering with someone like you? Someone with the expertise and commitment to develop a really significant, sustainable agriculture initiative. I'd say that sounds too good to be true, he replied, with a laugh that held no suspicion, only the weary humor of someone who had heard similar promises before and seen them evaporate when reality intruded. It's not too good to be true if the partnership is structured properly and both parties bring real value to the enterprise. You would contribute your expertise, your land, your existing operation, and your commitment to sustainable practices. I would contribute capital, business development, resources, marketing support, and access to distribution networks that could help scale the operation across the Mediterranean region. I could see him processing the implications, his mind working through possibilities and challenges with the methodical thoroughness of someone trained in scientific thinking. That's a very generous offer, Mr. Theokoropoulos. But why would you want to partner with me specifically? There are much larger agricultural operations in Greece that would represent safer investments, because larger operations are usually committed to conventional methods that I believe are ultimately unsustainable. I'm looking for someone who shares my vision of environmental responsibility and long-term thinking. Someone who understands that the future of agriculture depends on working with natural systems rather than against them. It was a compelling argument, and I could see that it resonated with his deepest beliefs about farming and environmental stewardship. But there was something else in his expression, a wariness that suggested he was not as naive about business relationships as his youth and rural background might suggest. And this has nothing to do with the fact that I'm married to your daughter." The question caught me off guard, not because I hadn't expected it, but because of the direct way he asked it. No accusations, no suspicion, just a straightforward request for clarification that demanded an equally straightforward response. "Of course, it has something to do with that," I said, allowing a note of paternal warmth to enter my voice. "I want to see Sophia happy, and I want to see her married to a man who can provide for her future. But I'm also a businessman. I don't make investment decisions based on sentiment alone. If I didn't believe that you were genuinely talented and that this partnership could be genuinely profitable, family connections wouldn't be enough to motivate my interest." He nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with my explanation. "What kind of scale are you thinking about?" "Initial investment of €2 million, with the potential for additional funding as the operation expands. We would structure it as a limited partnership, with you maintaining operational control and majority ownership of the farming operations, while I would handle the business development and marketing aspects." I watched his face carefully as I named the figure, looking for any sign of the greed or desperation that would make him easier to manipulate. But Kostas Vasilakis simply absorbed the information with the same methodical consideration he had shown throughout our conversation. "That's a significant amount of money," he said finally. "What kind of returns would you expect on that investment?" "Modest returns initially, growing to substantial returns as the operation scales. But honestly, Kostas, the financial returns are only part of what interests me about this opportunity. I'm approaching 60 years old, and I'm beginning to think more seriously about the kind of legacy I want to leave. Supporting sustainable agriculture that could serve as a model for environmental responsibility throughout the Mediterranean region appeals to me on a level that goes beyond simple profit calculations." It was a masterful performance, and I almost believed it myself. The combination of practical business opportunity and higher moral purpose was exactly the kind of proposition that would appeal to someone like Kostas Vasilakis. But even as I spoke, I was analyzing his reactions, looking for any sign that my offer was achieving its real purpose, creating a pathway for him to leave my daughter while maintaining his dignity and his financial security. "I'm very interested," he said finally. "But I would need time to consider all the implications, and I would want Sophia to be involved in any discussions about moving forward." The mention of my daughter's involvement sent a spike of panic through my chest, but I managed to maintain my composed exterior. "Of course. This is exactly the kind of decision that should be made together as a family. I appreciate that you understand that, Mr. Theokoropoulos. Some men might expect their business relationships to take precedence over their family relationships. Please, call me Alexandros, and I think you'll find that I've always believed family comes first. Everything else is just details." We shook hands as the sun disappeared behind the ancient columns of the Parthenon, and I left the hotel feeling cautiously optimistic about the success of my initial approach. Kostas Vasilakis had shown genuine interest in my offer, and more importantly, he had shown no suspicion about my underlying motivations. The hook was baited and deployed. Now I simply needed to wait for him to take it. But as I drove through the winding streets of Athens toward my empty mansion in Kefisia, I found myself thinking about the conversation in ways I hadn't expected. Kostas Vasilakis was not the simple farmer I had imagined. He was intelligent, principled, genuinely passionate about his work, and clearly devoted to my daughter. Under different circumstances, in a different life where the past had not created such dangerous connections between our families, I might have genuinely enjoyed working with him. Under different circumstances, I might have been proud to call him my son-in-law, but circumstances were what they were, and pride was a luxury I could not afford. The next phase of my plan would require more delicate manipulation, more careful pressure applied at precisely the right moments. I would need to create situations where Kostas would begin to question whether his marriage to Sophia was truly in her best interests, whether his love for her was worth the complications it created for her, relationship with her family and her future security. Over the next 2 weeks, I launched what I privately called Operation Separation, a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to plant seeds of doubt in my daughter's marriage, while maintaining the appearance of a supportive father and potential business partner. It required the kind of delicate psychological manipulation that I had perfected during decades of complex business negotiations. But applying these skills to my own family felt like using a scalpel to perform surgery on my own heart. The strategy was multifaceted and subtle. First, I would gradually increase the pressure on Kostas through seemingly innocent business discussions, creating stress that would inevitably spill over into his relationship with Sophia. Second, I would orchestrate social situations that highlighted the fundamental differences between his background and ours, making both of them increasingly aware of the challenges their marriage would face. Third, I would use my considerable influence within Athens society to create a subtle but persistent atmosphere of disapproval toward their union. And throughout it all, I would present myself as the loving father who only wanted what was best for his daughter's happiness. The first opportunity came during a family dinner I arranged for the following Saturday. I invited several prominent couples from our social circle, business leaders, politicians, cultural figures, ostensibly to celebrate Sophia and Kostas' marriage, but actually to demonstrate just how out of place a farmer from Macedonia would feel among Athens' elite. The guest list was carefully curated to include people who would be polite but patronizing, who would ask the kind of questions that revealed their assumptions about social hierarchy and cultural sophistication. The dinner took place on the terrace of my Kefizia mansion, overlooking gardens that Melina had spent years perfecting. The tables were set with our finest china and crystal, the kind that had been in my family for 3 generations and represented more wealth than most people saw in a lifetime. The staff served dishes prepared by my personal chef, paired with wines from vineyards that I owned in Santorini and Nemea. Everything was designed to overwhelm through elegance and expense. Sophia arrived wearing a simple black dress that probably cost more than Kostas made in a month from his olive farm, but she wore it with the unconscious grace of someone who had never questioned her right to such luxury. Kostas appeared in what was obviously his best suit, well-tailored, but clearly purchased for this specific occasion, the kind of careful expenditure that proud men make when they want to show proper respect for important social obligations. I watched him throughout the evening, studying his reactions to the casual display of wealth that surrounded him. He was unfailingly polite, genuinely interested in conversations about art and politics, and surprisingly knowledgeable about subjects ranging from ancient Greek literature to contemporary environmental policy. But I could see the strain in his eyes, the subtle tension that came from being constantly evaluated by people who had never worked with their hands or worried about crop yields or struggled to make loan payments on time. "So tell us about organic farming," said Dimitrios Kanalopoulos, a shipping magnate whose idea of agriculture was the decorative olive tree in his backyard. "It must be fascinating to work so closely with nature." The question was delivered with a kind of condescending interest that wealthy urbanites show toward rural occupations, curiosity mixed with pity, as if farming were a quaint hobby rather than a serious profession requiring sophisticated knowledge and considerable skill. Kostas responded graciously, explaining the complexities of soil management and pest control without chemical pesticides. But I could see how the conversation reinforced his status as an outsider among people who viewed manual labor as something performed by others. When Kanalopoulos's wife asked whether organic produce really tasted better than regular food, as if scientific agriculture was somehow irregular or artificial, Sophia's jaw tightened with the kind of anger that suggested she was beginning to understand the purpose of this gathering. "You know," I interjected smoothly, "Kostas and I have been discussing some exciting business opportunities that could help expand sustainable agriculture throughout the Mediterranean region. It's exactly the kind of forward-thinking environmental initiative that our generation needs to support." The mention of business opportunities immediately shifted the tenor of the conversation. Suddenly, Kostas was no longer an interesting curiosity but a potential investment opportunity, and the questions became more pointed and practical. How much land did he own? What were his annual revenues? What kind of growth projections could he support? Did he have experience managing larger operations? I watched my daughter's face as her husband fielded these inquiries with patient dignity, and I could see the moment when she realized what was happening. Sophia had inherited her mother's emotional intelligence along with my strategic mind, and she understood that this dinner was not a celebration but an evaluation. She began answering questions on Kostas's behalf, subtly steering conversations toward topics where his expertise would shine rather than his limitations would be exposed. But the damage was already done. By the end of the evening, it was clear to everyone present that while Kostas Vasilakis was a decent man with admirable principles, he was also dramatically out of his depth in the world that Sophia had been born to inhabit. The other guests left with polite expressions of congratulations and private certainties that this marriage would not survive the realities of cultural difference and economic disparity. After the last guest departed, I found myself alone with Sophia and Kostas on the terrace. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine and night-blooming cereus, and Athens sparkled below us like a carpet of diamonds. It should have been a moment of peaceful family intimacy, but instead the atmosphere crackled with tension and unspoken accusations. "That was quite a performance, Papa," Sophia said quietly, using the childhood name that she employed only when she was very angry or very hurt. "Did you accomplish what you were hoping to accomplish?" "I'm not sure what you mean," I replied, though we both knew exactly what she meant. "I thought it would be nice for our friends to meet Kostas properly in a relaxed social setting." Relaxed? Her voice carried the kind of controlled fury that I had seen her mother display perhaps 3 times in 20 years of marriage. "You invited the most judgmental, status-conscious people in Athens to evaluate my husband like he was applying for membership in an exclusive club." Kostas placed a gentle hand on her arm, his touch immediately calming her visible agitation. "It's all right, Agapimo. Your father's friends were perfectly polite. I enjoyed the conversations." "You shouldn't have to endure conversations like that," Sophia said, her anger now mixed with the kind of protective love that made my chest ache with a combination of pride and guilt. "You shouldn't have to prove your worth to people who measure everything by bank account balances and family genealogy." "Everyone has to prove their worth in some way," Kostas replied philosophically. "At least your father's friends asked intelligent questions about subjects they genuinely wanted to understand. His grace under pressure was remarkable, and for A moment I felt genuine admiration for the young man my daughter had chosen to marry. But admiration was a luxury I could not afford when my entire future depended on separating them as quickly and completely as possible. "I hope you didn't find the evening too overwhelming," I said to Kostas, injecting just enough paternal concern into my voice to sound sincere. Sophia's social circle can be quite intense for people who aren't accustomed to that level of ... sophistication. It was a calculated insult disguised as solicitude, designed to make him feel inadequate while giving me plausible deniability if challenged. But Sophia saw through the manipulation immediately. "Kostas is perfectly sophisticated," she said coldly. "He simply has the sophistication that comes from creating something meaningful with his own hands, rather than inheriting it from previous generations." The barb hit its mark with surgical precision. Sophia knew exactly how sensitive I was about accusations that my success was unearned, that I was merely a caretaker of other men's achievements rather than a builder in my own right. But instead of rising to her provocation, I absorbed the insult and used it to advance my larger strategy. "You're absolutely right," I said with wounded dignity. "I apologize if my comments sounded patronizing. I have nothing but respect for accomplishments, and I hope he'll consider me a friend as well as a father-in-law." The apology caught Sophia off guard, as I had intended. She was prepared to fight against my hostility, but not against my apparent contrition. Kostas stepped into the resulting silence with the kind of diplomatic grace that suggested he had considerable experience managing family tensions. "I would be honored to consider you a friend," he said warmly, "and I hope you'll feel comfortable offering advice as Sophia and I navigate this new phase of our lives together." "Actually," I said, seizing the opening he had provided, "there is something I've been wanting to discuss with both of you. The business opportunity I mentioned earlier, it's become quite urgent due to some unexpected market developments." I spent the next 20 minutes outlining a fictional agricultural investment consortium that supposedly needed immediate partnership agreements to secure European Union funding for sustainable farming initiatives. The story was elaborate and convincing, built on real programs and actual market trends that I had researched extensively. The opportunity would require Kostas to travel frequently throughout the Mediterranean region, establishing relationships with other organic producers and evaluating potential expansion sites. "It sounds like an incredible opportunity," Sophia said when I finished my presentation. "But wouldn't that mean you'd be away from the farm for months at a time?" "Initially, yes," I replied. "But that's the nature of any significant business. Expansion, short-term sacrifice for long-term benefit." I could see Kostas processing the implications, weighing the potential benefits against the personal costs. He was clearly tempted by the opportunity to advance sustainable agriculture on a much larger scale, but equally concerned about the impact on his new marriage and his existing responsibilities. "When would this need to start?" he asked. "Ideally, within the next month. The EU funding cycles operate according to very strict timelines, and if we miss this window, the opportunity might not arise again for several years." It was a lie, of course, but a plausible one, and it created exactly the kind of pressure I needed, forcing them to make a major life decision during the fragile early weeks of their marriage, when they were still learning how to balance individual desires with shared commitments. "Could I have some time to think about it?" Kostas asked. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity I've dreamed about. But I want to make sure Sophia and I discuss all the implications before making a commitment." "Of course," I said magnanimously. "Take all the time you need, but please don't take too Much time opportunities like this have a tendency to disappear if people hesitate too long. They left my house that night with polite expressions of gratitude and private reservations that I could practically see churning behind their eyes. The seeds of doubt were beginning to sprout, creating the kind of stress that would test even the strongest relationship. All I needed was patience and persistence, gradually increasing the pressure until something broke. But patience, it turned out, was not something I possessed in sufficient quantities. Over the following week, I made what I now recognize as a critical error in judgment. Instead of allowing the natural consequences of stress and social pressure to work their subtle magic, I began pushing harder and faster, driven by a growing desperation that clouded my strategic thinking. I started calling Kostas daily with new developments in the business opportunity, each more urgent than the last. I arranged additional social events where the cultural differences between him and our circle would be highlighted. I even went so far as to have Dmitry draft preliminary partnership agreements that would require Kostas to relocate his primary residence to Brussels for at least 2 years. The strategy was sound in theory, but disastrous in execution. Instead of creating gradual doubt, I was creating obvious manipulation. And Sophia, who had inherited my own ability to recognize tactical maneuvering, began noticing patterns that should have remained invisible. The crisis came on a Thursday evening in early September. I had invited Sophia and Kostas to dinner at the house, ostensibly to celebrate his tentative agreement to move forward with the business partnership. Melina had prepared moussaka and dolmades using recipes that had been in our family for generations. And I had opened a bottle of wine from the same vineyard where Helena and I had spent our honeymoon 30 years earlier. Everything should have been perfect. The atmosphere was warm and familial. The conversation was pleasant and relaxed. And Kostas seemed genuinely excited about the opportunity to expand his environmental work on an international scale. But I could see something calculating behind Sophia's eyes. A watchful quality that suggested she was studying my behavior rather than simply enjoying the evening. "Papa," she said during dessert, her voice carrying a deceptive casualness that immediately put me on alert. "I've been curious about something. How did you first learn about sustainable agriculture? It seems like a relatively recent interest for someone who's spent most of his career in shipping and real estate." The question was perfectly reasonable, and I had prepared answers for exactly this kind of inquiry. But something in her tone, some subtle note of suspicion, made me realize that this was not casual curiosity but active investigation. Environmental consciousness has been growing throughout the business community for years, I replied smoothly.